Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joanna, and I will be your operator for today's conference. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the National LAN Event Conference Call. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask questions at this time, simply press star followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. And if you would like to withdraw your question, simply press the pound key. I will now turn the call over to our first speaker, Kayleen Challenge. Ma'am, you may begin your conference.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on the National Learning and Action Network for LAN events. We are very happy to have you with us today as we discuss the important topic of improving immunization rates, how to engage and effectively communicate. My name is Kayleen Challenge. I'm a program manager with Telegen and the Quality Innovation Network National Coordinating Center. So starting off with just a few reminders and housekeeping items before we get started today. Thanks for joining us in the WebEx Event Center. You are going to need to access your registration confirmation email and unique registration ID to be able to log into the WebEx today. Once you're in there, my colleague Jerry Hineker is going to be monitoring our WebEx chat board. So please be sure to participate as we go along and feel free to ask your questions in chat. Additionally, slides, resources, and a recording from today's session will be posted on the qioprogram.org website under the News and Events tab. All right, let's start by reviewing today's agenda. First, I'm going to go over the continuing education, or CE, details. Then I will introduce you to each of our wonderful speakers today. We have Libby Hoy, who will be sharing her personal story, Dr. Gregory Poland with the Mayo Clinic, and Caroline Poland with Taylor University. Following our speaker presentations, there will be a facilitated discussion where questions from the audience will be addressed. Again, we're going to take those in the chat box and over the phone. And if we do not get to your question right away, know that we're compiling those, and we're going to try to attempt to address as many as possible during the discussion portion of today's call. And then finally, I will just wrap up with a reminder to complete our post-event assessment and put in a nice plug for some of our upcoming calls. So I'd like to take a minute now to remind our participants about the purpose of this important series of national learning and sharing events. Without reading all the content on the slide, I'll just pull out a few high points. The audience for these events is broad and inclusive of a variety of healthcare provider types, partners, and even patients. The purpose of these webinars is to offer virtual learning and sharing events with a focus on ideas and concepts related to healthcare quality improvement. We ask the participants to think of actionable ways to implement the ideas and concepts presented today and make a commitment to share the information with your teams and organizations. And finally, we are always open to new ideas and suggestions for topics to bring to this audience, so please feel free to send your ideas to the chat, and or you'll see an opportunity to do that in the post-event assessment. We are hoping to make these calls as interactive as possible, which can be challenged given the large audience that we have. Therefore, we do ask you to commit as individuals to being attentive, active, and actionable, thinking about all the ways the content is relevant to your work and priorities. We welcome your active participation. You can go ahead and click the green check in the WebEx application. You can click the megaphone button and choose yes in the drop-down menu. You can also chat yes in the chat box if you will make this commitment to us today. Thank you. All right. We are excited to be offering continuing education credits to all attendees for participating in today's session. We offer credit to all physicians, physician assistants, registered nurses, nurse practitioners, dietitians, pharmacists, and pharmacy technicians. We also offer certificates of attendance. Should you have requests for additional accreditation types, we welcome those suggestions as well. Again, you can do that in the chat or the post-event assessment. In order to apply for continuing education credit, you must have attended the entire event, complete the post-event assessment upon exiting this WebEx session, and please note that the CE evaluation can only be accessed by following the application site hyperlink at the end of the post-event assessment. For all assistance related to the CE process, please email Nikki Rosales. Her email is on the slide. It's also going to be posted in chat. This slide is a disclaimer from our partnering providers, CRW Associates. This activity awards 1.5 AMA credit hours for physician and physician assistants. You may reference this slide for full CE statements. This activity also awards 1.5 contact hours for nurses and 1.5 continuing professional education units for dietitians. The following are the accreditation statements for those entities. And another disclaimer. We would like to report that the planners and faculty for this event, CRW and Associates, and Tilligen, do not have any financial relationships to disclose, nor is any commercial support received for this activity. And finally, here are our disclosures of financial relationships. All right, got through all of that. In an attempt to get a better idea of what types of organizations are represented on the call, we invite you to respond to a poll indicating where you are working. And Nikki's going to open up that poll for us. Thanks, Nikki. While we're waiting for those poll results to load, I'll review today's session objectives. By the end of the call today, we are hoping that everyone will be able to understand the spectrum of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine thinking, explain how to make data-driven decisions related to vaccines, describe patient-centric elements of vaccine decision-making, articulate common cognitive styles patients employ in making decisions about vaccines, and understand the preferred cognitive styles and decision-making model to increase vaccine acceptance. We still have just a couple of seconds to wait for that poll result to pop up. Awesome. Thanks so much for everybody who participated in that poll. We really appreciate it. It looks like we've got a lot of great Queen QIO representatives as well as some other partners on the line as well. All right. So at this point, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Libby Hoy is the founder and CEO of TFC Safety Partners. Libby's going to share a personal story illustrating the impact of immunizations on her life. Thank you so much for being here, Libby. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody. And Caitlin and Nikki, thank you very much for having me join today. This is such an important topic and, really just has the opportunity to have such a tremendous impact on our public health. So I'm happy to share our experience with immunization. So I come to all of this work from the perspective of a family caregiver. I'm the mom of 3 sons living well with mitochondrial disease. And when the kids were younger in the mid-90s, I talked with our team. We had about 6 specialists following each of the boys. And we talked with our team. We talked about immunizations, and we talked about the risks and the benefits and the risks should they encounter any of these diseases, measles, mumps, whooping cough, as kids growing up with chronic illness. And so we decided to go ahead and immunize all of our kids. I felt really comfortable and confident in that decision. And I remember as they got to school age, being a little bit frustrated with the families who had healthy children who were opting out of immunizations because I just didn't feel like there was a good understanding of how that impacted others around them that were immunosuppressed. So I remember being really frustrated about that. And then I also kind of followed the transition as my kids entered high school that families with young children at that point were almost frowned upon if they were having their child immunized. Like, you're not being careful enough, you're not thinking it through, you're not being educated, which to me kind of struck me as somewhat ironic. And I was, again, really kind of frustrated with the way that the trends were going because I felt that healthy families' option not to immunize was putting my family in more danger. And so in 2014, my son was asked to play water polo in a water polo tournament in New Zealand, where whooping cough is actually rampant. And I felt really confident that as he went, he was very well protected. He had had all his immunizations. We were up to date. boosters and what have you. And so I felt really good about his protection as he went off to play in New Zealand. I never thought about my own protection in all of those years and my own risk for these diseases. I was the youngest of 9 children, and I don't even have a birth certificate, much less any shot records. So I just sort of assumed I was immunized, and that was a stupid assumption. And so you can guess what happened. When he returned, he never got whooping cough, but he brought it with him, and I got it. And that took me out for about 6 months. As someone living with asthma, I was first misdiagnosed and then eventually diagnosed. But this really impacted my life heavily for about 6 months. And I was so worried when I was around other people because I was afraid of what I was bringing forward. So I tried really hard not to be around any young children, not to be around anybody who was vulnerable. But that was really difficult. And so that lack of awareness, here I was frustrated with the other healthy families who had made the decision not to immunize, and yet I didn't do enough research for myself. And so I think my takeaway for all of this and for your conversation today is that there's such a tremendous opportunity and need for better information and to be presented to the general public in very highly relatable ways. And I think you have some great experts who are going to share some insights as to how we can make this information really relatable and understandable for all populations, because the value of immunization, as I learned firsthand, is tremendous. And so I appreciate, again, you letting me share my story and really compelling all of you who have taken the time out of your busy day to join this call and to learn with these wonderful speakers. We really need to attend to this and really take it back to our communities. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Libby, for sharing your story and, reminding us that this is a community endeavor. So thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregory Poland. He's a Mary Lowell Leary Emeritus Professor of Medicine and Distinguished Investigator of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Dr. Poland will discuss communication strategies to overcome hesitation around vaccines. Dr. Poland, we are thrilled to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And wow, Libby, what a story. And you really did communicate well the importance of understanding this material. I'm excited to present it today, and particularly excited to present it with my daughter, who's a mental health professional. And she and I have ended up publishing together on this idea when she first brought it up at a dinner table conversation, that the way physicians and nurses were handling vaccine education and communication really was not consistent with what was known about cognitive learning theory. So I'm going to kind of set it up for you, and then my daughter, Caroline, will actually go through at least an overview of what it means to educate in a different way. So with that, as Libby sort of talked about with parents who don't immunize children, there's a background to this, and I call it a story of the co-collusion of belligerents. There are the anti-vaccine groups that are distributing material that is factually incorrect, but in a very emotional way to try to get parents' attention. There's an uncritical media who love to fan the flames of any controversy. There are, frankly, unscrupulous physicians, scientists, chiropractors, naturopaths, etc., who I think more than anything feel a profit motive. And then unaccountable organizations, and I'll show you some examples of those. This is a story, as I'm going to reveal this, of contrasting values and worldviews. A belief that science is a democracy and that we get to vote on facts. And a fundamental communication and belief divide between those who are anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitant and what we know scientifically. There's a cultural context to this too. There are people who are simply risk intolerant, particularly of commission. So we often talk when we're talking about parents of omission and commission. You'll have parents that will say, gee, if something happened to my son and there was something I could have done to prevent it, I'd never forgive myself. Walk into the next room and the parent says, well, gee, if I give this vaccine and anything happens, I could never forgive myself. And rarely do those two cross. We live in an information-rich but knowledge-poor environment, and yet viral communication, an anti-authority stance toward any sort of institution, a failure of public health and health systems to educate, and as I call it, create a meta-narrative of vaccine value. Excuse me, I have to cough. And a media and evidence-based rather than evidence-based approach to how we think. I myself am just getting over a laryngitis, so I apologize. A fundamental question then is, can anti-vaccinationists and vaccine-hesitant individuals be reconciled with the data and actually become vaccine adopters? And my experience is that yes, not all and not always, but in general, yes. Take a moment to just look at this. I'll give you a second to read it. Now let me go to the next slide and show you what I mean. I want you to understand the words that I put in red there to get a sense of how some anti-vaccinationists think. This is a Canadian woman, declined to have her children immunized. All 7 of them developed whooping cough. Fortunately, none of them died and none of them were hospitalized. But she set out to prove that we were right. In other words, it wasn't a debate about the fact. It was proving that what I believe is right. She was scared. There were issues of trust. There were questions in her mind of conspiracy. Were vaccines even needed? And were we doing harm? This is the idea of acts of commission. So thinking now about this spectrum of vaccine hesitancy, you have people from the pro-vaccine to the anti-vaccine side and everything in between. People who are innumerate, who cannot manipulate numbers and probabilities. To people who have very low complexity cognitive styles. These are often the conspiratorial. And people who just have misperceptions. And then media and celebrities who are benefiting from the controversy that they cause. So we have people who are uninformed, misinformed, who have low complexity cognitive styles, who are conspiratorial thinking, fear-based thinking, bandwagoning, which is basically just peer pressure, who have different and conflicting values. And for some people, as I've come to learn after 30-some years in this field, who this becomes a life cause and they develop fixed beliefs. Let me show you an example. This is a direct quote from one of the anti-vaccinationists. To our community, Andrew Wakefield is Nelson Mandela and Jesus Christ rolled up into one. He's a symbol of how all of us feel. Think about what this really says. To our community, so it's us versus them, this is somebody with the status of Christ or Nelson Mandela. He's a symbol of what we feel, not what we know, not what the facts are, but what we feel. Well, from Jenner all the way till today, vaccine objections have existed, and they've often had the following kind of shared characteristics. That somehow vaccines were going to cause life-threatening disorders, that they had highly toxic components, that they failed to impart durable immunity, that is, immunity that would last for a long time, unlike, quote, natural diseases. And more recently, they've added to that the idea that vaccines cause autoimmunity. Well, the truth is, at both the individual and public health level, vaccines are overwhelmingly safe and effective. Like everything produced by man, nothing's perfectly safe and nothing's perfectly effective. But vaccine recommendations are based on the best available scientific data. They are subject to intense, rigorous evaluation. And yet, like all recommendations, they change and improve with time as new data and new information becomes available. I often show this slide or talk about this with patients who are concerned. Let's just take a look at some of the risks. Well, the risk of an anaphylactic reaction to a vaccine, this would be the most common serious reaction that can occur with a vaccine, is somewhere north of 1 in a million. Well, let's look at, quote, natural diseases. If you get tetanus, you have 1 in 2 who die. If you get measles, 1 to 3 out of 1,000 will die. About 1 in 8,000 of us this coming year will die of influenza. Well, look at these other risks. Car crash, 1 in 5,000. And yet we accept that risk every day because the benefit exceeds that risk. And so I put that quote there, acting in one's own self-interest does not always best serve one's self-interest. True enough that when a new vaccine comes on the market, we know a lot about it, but I've had parents ask me, well, can you guarantee me that there's not a 1 in a million chance of this happening? You can never make that guarantee. I hope all of you recognize that. We will never have studies that involve 3 to 5 million people where you could detect a rate that rare. But regardless of the rarity of that, you have to say, but what's the risk of disease and of complications from that disease? And when those exceed whatever risk there are, wisdom resides in choosing what offers more benefit than risk. Well, the reality of it is that individuals, when you really think about it, get vaccines for at least one of only 3 reasons. Fear, bandwagoning, and because they're coerced. Bandwagoning, as I mentioned, is sort of peer pressure. I've listed down below it. Vaccine uptake is heavily dependent upon the sense that those around you whom you respect are also taking vaccines. We've seen this work in the opposite way, where vaccine refusal is heavily dependent upon the sense that those around you, those you surround yourself with, what some have called, and I'm not being sexist here, it's what they've called the mommy blogs, are also rejecting vaccines. Thomas Gilovich, who's a professor of psychology at Cornell, looked at, he wasn't investigating just vaccines, but common flaws that people have in their reasoning. And he divided it into 2 broad categories, the cognitive and the motivational or social. Here are some of the cognitive. You'll see how these ring true when we're talking about anti-vaccine thinking. The desire to find order and predictability in what is truly random data, or difficulty in detecting or correcting biases, or the eagerness to interpret ambiguous and inconsistent data to fit theories. The motivational side of it is wishful thinking and self-serving distortion, or taking secondhand information or what's been miscommunicated as gospel, if you will, and exaggerated impression of social support. And there's another one that psychologists have put their finger on that I think is really important, and it's called belief-dependent realism. And it answers the question, why are these beliefs maintained despite overwhelming data to the contrary? And what they've found out is that beliefs tend to come first in human thinking. Explanations are then constructed to support those beliefs. And it happens in 2 major ways. One is patternicity, which is finding meaningful patterns in meaningful and meaningless data. So this is the kind of thing you hear about of, all of us got flu vaccine on the block and 2 people developed leukemia. And they want to blame leukemia on the vaccine or on the electrical wire or whatever they can find in common. They found a pattern among meaningless data. or agenticity, which is infusing patterns with meaning, intention, or agency. And this leads to a positive feedback loop of belief confirmation, despite data to the contrary, and a cognitive process that convinces someone that their beliefs are truths. So some examples of this. I got involved in this in the 1970s. Some of you may remember that the whole-cell pertussis vaccine was being blamed for sudden infant death syndrome. We now know that was coincidence. The vaccine was being given at an age when sudden infant death syndrome tended to occur. The incidence was equal in countries that used the vaccine and that didn't. Hepatitis B and MS in France, the anthrax vaccine and Gulf War syndrome, Lyme vaccine and autoimmune arthritis, all of these disproven, none of them with a biologic basis, and yet people who strongly hold these fixed beliefs. Currently, we still have, after 2 decades of misinformation, the idea that MMR somehow causes autism, or that thimerosal, the mercury component, did it, or that somehow we're overloading children and adults' immune systems with, quote, too many vaccines. And the most recent one, that HPV vaccine is causing sudden death or autoimmune disorders. All beliefs that are contradicted by the data every time we look in every country we've looked. And then, regardless of your politics, I chose this more as an example of celebrities and eminence rather than science and data. Healthy young child goes to the doctor, gets pumped with a massive shot of many vaccines, doesn't feel good and changes, autism, many such cases. You see the same taxonomy of reasoning flaws that we talked about earlier. When I first signed on to the Internet in 1992, there were, of course, no anti-vaccine groups on the Internet. And as best I can now count them, there are just shy of 60 million such entries and over 300,000 sites devoted to spreading misinformation about vaccines. And you look at some of them like National Vaccine Information Center. Sounds legitimate until you actually go to it and read it. Well, prompted by all of this, I wrote and published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine called The Age-Old Struggle Against the Anti-Vaccinationists, making the point that this has gone on and on every time a new vaccine is introduced and every time disproven. And yet people have to get hurt, unfortunately, before they believe it as a result of getting an infection. Well, let me just take a couple. One is that this idea that natural immunity is safer than vaccine-induced immunity. Well, the truth is that Guillain-Barré syndrome has a far higher incidence after influenza infection than from the vaccine. The vaccine, unlike the disease, does not cause myocarditis, pneumonia, bronchitis, sinusitis, death, or significant amounts of lost school or work time. The disease does. So think about this when people say this, when they talk about natural hepatitis B leading on to chronic cirrhosis and liver cancer, or measles, or human papillomavirus, which can never be cured once you're infected, or chickenpox or tetanus, pertussis, any of these diseases. Does this concept of natural disease even make sense? Well, my daughter and myself and a neurologist, a neuroepidemiologist, published a paper in The Lancet a handful of years ago looking at this. And so what we said is, let's just make the base case that everybody who's eligible, everybody in the U.S. who can get the vaccine, gets the 2009 H1N1 vaccine, back when the pandemic was starting. And then we made the next case on the right-hand side of, let's assume nobody gets the vaccine and the usual rate of infection occurs. Well, if everybody gets the vaccine, presumably up to 22 people could die, perhaps as a result of an anaphylactic reaction that somehow was not treated properly. If we give nobody the vaccine, then about 13,000 people die. If we give everybody the vaccine, about 500 people get hospitalized. If we give nobody the vaccine, about 250,000 people get hospitalized. If we give everybody the vaccine, we might have up to 500 cases of Guillain-Barré in the worst case scenario. If we give nobody the vaccine, we'd have between 14,000 and 25,000 cases. So you see, there's no risk-free decision. But if you're wise, you look at the risks of not taking the vaccine, i.e. getting the disease, and the highest known risk of getting the vaccine, and really you can make only one reasonable conclusion. The harms of not countering this is it creates hesitancy in otherwise vaccine-accepting persons. I've seen this happen. I've watched nurses walk into a room and say, you know, we're supposed to offer you this flu vaccine. I don't know if you want it or not. Well, you can imagine what that does from a trust point of view, or conspiratorial thinking, or this endless drumbeat of somehow MMR causing autism. This leads to lower vaccination coverage rates and outbreaks of diseases. Let me give you one example from this Andrew Wakefield and MMR and autism thing. The U.S. ranks 114th among countries vaccinating their 1-year-olds against measles. Look at the countries that are more successful. Thailand, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Botswana, Zimbabwe. If you look at the actual map of this, we spend more money on health care than just about anybody else and have among the lower immunization rates. In Europe right now, as a result of this, they are having a massive outbreak across the EU of measles with over 40,000 cases and many deaths in children whose parents elected not to immunize them. George Santayana, I think, said it best. Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. So the next step, I think, is to create a new meta-narrative, a change in values, attitudes, and beliefs. What we have now, a colleague of mine said, is a legion of small narratives that compete with each other rather than the grand meta-narrative of reason. Eventually, small narratives compete and grow into larger agendas that control. And I personally think, and I think my daughter will emphasize this, is we tend as physicians and nurses to use the language of reason and consciousness, of an analytic type style. And we ignore the issues of reality perception and reality construction, the value of story, even though we know that humans make decisions not by reason, but by emotional projection and cognitive brains that form stories that dictate their decisions. And often those stories they tell themselves are fundamentally flawed. So I'll give you 3 quick examples of what I have used with the vaccine hesitant. I don't mess around. I tell them HPV is sexually transmitted cancer, and we can prevent that. This is a patient of mine, a 39-year-old single mom of 3 children, who got pneumococcal infection. She had been seen 5 times in the healthcare system. Nobody asked what that scar was. I asked her, and she said, they had to remove my spleen because my drunk boyfriend punched me in the stomach and ruptured my spleen. And when you have your spleen out, you are very, very at elevated risk of having this happen. She was gangrenous from her hips down and her shoulders out, and they were going to amputate her, so she would just be a body with no arms and no legs. And they transferred her to us at Mayo Clinic. We were able to save a lot, but we had to amputate both feet and both hands, something which could have been prevented by a $20 vaccine. I show you this slide because I want you to never forget this. And then finally, a story I wrote called The Day That Jack Died. And it's a story about a man who rejected influenza vaccine despite my pleading with him to take this. And he wouldn't take it out of ignorance. And the point of the story is that ignorance kills. So let me summarize. why this vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine thinking, very false notions of causality, peer pressure, denialism, innumeracy, conspiratorial thinking, this low complexity cognition, this belief-dependent realism that we see what we want to see, and the power of story and parable in creating and framing how people think, and frankly, the inability of public health leaders to counter all of that above. So the lesson is, most people think at a very minimal level. I'm sorry to say it, level 1, limited to their biases, unobservant of the data before them, a form of premature cognitive narrowing, if you will. Let me just show you an example. This is a ad I found, and I don't have a way to poll you, but if I ask you what you see, most people notice the little piece of food in the man's tooth. What I noticed as a physician is I had never seen a 6-fingered woman before. And the point is that people ignore the data and they see what they want to see or what's most obvious. And arguably, a 6-fingered hand is of more importance than a piece of food in the tooth. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pullen. This is Kaylin again, and thank you for your presentation. I know it pairs very perfectly with Caroline's presentation, which we'll get to in just a minute. I just want to encourage everyone to kind of take a minute to kind of pause for reflection. If you have reactions, if you have questions, we can keep those in chat, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A over the phone after our next presentation. But maybe if anyone, has a story that they would like to share or a reaction, we can see if there's anything on the phone. So Joanna, can you just let our participants know if they wanted to share a reaction, how they could get into the phone line to be able to do that?
Certainly. At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, you may press star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's star 1 to ask a question. We have one question on the line. Please state your first and last name. Your line is open. Hello,
I'm not hearing a question.
My question is, how do you find the balance between teaching patients about the reality of vaccines and kind of going overboard with the scare factor, when it comes to trying to get people to vaccinate or vaccinate their children?
Great question, and congratulations for asking that, because that formed the basis of a study showing that people who did not have trust in their healthcare provider and the healthcare provider sort of went toward the scare tactic actually reduced their trust. So this is something that I use with patients that I have developed a rapport with and trust, because I want to, sort of cut through all of the flack and chatter about it. But I think you'll hear from Caroline next exactly some of that balance and methods of trust building. Good point.
Thank you. Thank you for calling in with that. Maybe we'll go ahead, and I do see some additional questions coming in through the chat, and we will compile those as we move into Caroline's presentation. And there'll be additional opportunities for us to take more questions, both from the chat and over the phone. I did see some great reactions in the chat as well, that it was a powerful presentation, and Kelly O'Neill says, thank you for all you do to learn and promote vaccines. This is inspiring and makes me want to work even harder to continue the promotion. And so we're really excited to kind of move from this into the next presentation with Caroline Pullen, who's going to get us going to the next step of this conversation. conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Caroline Pullen. She is the director of the Taylor University Counseling Center in Upland, Indiana. Caroline is going to discuss strategies to assist with vaccine decision-making and kind of get us to that acceptance piece. So Caroline, at this time, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. All right, well, it's great to be with you all today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it looks like to build trust in healthy ways through a communication style that we've developed called the Preferred Cognitive Styles and Decision-Making Model. We have a few objectives as we head into our time together today. The first would be to describe a very patient-centric set of elements of vaccine decision-making. What are our patients going through as they sit across from us in conversation? To articulate common cognitive styles that patients employ in making decisions about vaccines. And finally, to understand more about the Preferred Cognitive Styles and Decision-Making Model to help increase vaccine acceptance rates. This is an article that I published several years ago with an anthropology professor out at Texas State University. And this was a call for the need for a multidisciplinary perspective in the issues of vaccine hesitancy and acceptance. The fact is that multiple different professions are professional about certain areas of people's lives. And so as we sat together at the Academy of Arts and Sciences, we started looking at what professions need to be around the table as we begin to make decisions about vaccine hesitancy and acceptance in terms of communication styles or programs that we can put on to increase those rates. To give you a brief illustration, people make decisions in a variety of ways. Cognitive styles, heuristics, which are just those basic rules of thumb, emotions, data, and some other ways as well. But the critical piece is how you and your patients make decisions, especially health decisions, have major ramifications for outcomes, both in other areas of health and in vaccine acceptance or hesitancy. There's a few foundational concepts that I want to discuss as we move forward with this. The first being that each individual has a preferred cognitive style that they use while they're making decisions. This informs how they take in information, how they process that information, and how those things inform their decision-making. Now, each individual doesn't just have one cognitive style. While we have a preferred cognitive style, we also employ secondary and tertiary styles as well. I also want to comment on the fact that we might have a cognitive style that plays out in healthcare that might be different than cognitive styles in other areas. The health field tends to present information in a specific style, which is the analytical style. So as healthcare professionals, we are professionalized to present data and facts to our patients. And this is evident, of course, in the vaccine information statements that patients are given. So I've used this term cognitive style a few times. I thought I would define that for you. This is just a basic thinking style. It's a lens that impacts how an individual both perceives and processes information, particularly under conditions of uncertainty or potential threat. And while an individual may have, like I mentioned, a preferred cognitive style, we're also pulling from various cognitive styles throughout our decision-making process in various areas of our life. Information within the health professions, like I mentioned, is most often presented in one unimodal, fact-based, left-brain cognitive style, which is the analytical style. It's how we're educated, it's how we're professionalized, and it's how we engage in conversation with our patients across from us. But this reflects the primary style of the developers of the information and not the population at large. And sometimes there's a disconnect between the developers of information and the population at large. The primary use of this analytical cognitive style means that for a large percentage of the population, we educate in a way that does not meet their preferred cognitive style. Another way of saying that is we're educating them and we're missing the connection point with them potentially over and over because we're not presenting information in a way that they might be able to understand. So this led to a few questions that I started wrestling with. What if we could broaden the spectrum of vaccine education and expand our communication efforts with patients? And additionally, what if we could better understand how our patients are processing information across from us and how they make decisions regarding vaccines? Well, if we understand a patient's cognitive style, and if we're able to use their preferred cognitive style in discussion or education with them, we increase the likelihood of sharing information in a manner that assists them in making a healthy decision and engaging in healthy behaviors. If we meet their communication style, then we're assisting them in making those good and healthy decisions for themselves. In this case, we're talking about vaccine acceptance. So like my father mentioned, one day immediately following grad school, we were sitting around the kitchen table and chatting about issues of vaccine acceptance and hesitancy, and I just kind of blatantly looked at him and I said, well, Dad, I think you all have it wrong, which is exactly not what parents want to hear from their children. But that led to such a deep and enriching conversation that we were able to have about the importance of integrating some of what I had just come out of learning in grad school, the psychological and cognitive models and how people make decisions and how we move people through a process of change and behavior acceptance. So we placed what I had learned through my graduate studies into this conversation about vaccine education and came out with this article that we published in 2011 in Vaccine. And in that, we began to flesh out what this idea of the preferred cognitive styles and decision-making model looks like. So it's an empirically derived model using the idea that cognitive styles inform our decision-making in many areas of life, not just healthcare decisions, but also including healthcare decisions about vaccine acceptance and hesitancy. And this model recognizes that different cognitive styles utilize informed strategies for productive conversations with the end goal of improving the odds of our desired outcome. Again, with improving the odds of an increase in vaccine acceptance. This model guides healthcare professionals in having a productive conversation using language and strategies that are most meaningful to their patients, leading to a higher likelihood of behavior change. This is a basic table that kind of outlines each of those styles that we've talked about, some brief examples of what each of those styles looks like, and a couple strategies that you, as a healthcare professional, might use as you're sitting and engaging in those conversations. So again, you can find this table in Vaccine with some further explanations of each of these styles and strategies. I'm going to talk through a couple of these in the next couple minutes. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the analytical style. It's a style that we might know best working in the healthcare profession. It's left brain thinking. Facts and statistics are paramount to this type of style, and science is everything. A few identifying phrases that you might be able to look for if your patient is engaging in this style would be, I want to see the data so that I can make a decision here, or I need to understand the risks and benefits before I can make a decision. A great communication strategy for this particular style would again be that vaccine information statement that is important, useful, and beneficial information to this particular group because it provides the data that they need to make decisions. You can make your vaccine recommendations in a data-based manner with this particular group because facts and probabilities are paramount to their decision-making. With this style, you can review any health concerns and decisions with your patient in an analytical style. Let's move to the denialist style. If we're looking at this in terms of a spectrum, this might be on the opposite end of this spectrum where this style disbelieves accepted scientific facts despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. So there's a general low complexity of thinking that comes with this style. These are the people that are prone to believe conspiracy theories. A few identifying phrases that might clue you into the fact that you're sitting across from someone employing this denialist style might be, well, I don't really care what the data show, ... Or, well, you can't really trust them, meaning a doctor or a company that has engaged in some of this research. This patient that is engaging in the denialist style may view you as untrustworthy because you are part of the system. So it might not be anything that you particularly have done, but because of your training, you would be viewed as untrustworthy potentially. And they're likely to view research as biased and untrustworthy as well. This is often due to the fact that maybe pharmaceutical companies have sponsored some of that research. So a hard sell approach is actually more harmful than helpful to them since the facts are already suspect. Again, the vaccine information statements would not be helpful generally with this style because of these reasons. With this style, it generally takes a few visits to gain trust with them. And I think that can be one of the frustrating parts about working with someone who's employing this style because we move at a very quick pace throughout our days. And when we're looking at vaccine acceptance, let's just take influenza vaccine, for example, or in the fall, we want people to quickly move to a place of accepting it and getting their vaccine before they leave our office because this is a time-sensitive vaccine. Again, the hard sell approach is going to be more harmful in the long run than helpful. And so make sure that you're taking the time that they need to gain their trust and give them permission that they might need to work on developing trust. Don't demand it. You demand it, this will likely cause the end of the conversation or even leading you to being untrustworthy and then finding a new healthcare provider. The trust can be built with this style by choosing to listen to them well, giving them permission to take the time they need to process the information that you're sharing, inviting them to ask you any questions, and being open to hearing them without judgment. A few other communication strategies that may be helpful with this type: just be very consistent with the messaging from you and other trustworthy sources. Don't be pushy. Don't go into the hard sell, but just be consistent with that trustworthiness. Providing them education materials that they can take away from the office and look into in their own time if they desire might be helpful here. Again, allow them to ask questions and consider using motivational interviewing. I'm sure many of you on this call have varying levels of knowledge about motivational interviewing, so I thought I would just briefly outline what that looks like here. So in this type of conversation, the healthcare provider listens empathetically and has the patient voice the arguments for change or creates the rationale for change, or in this case, voicing some of the arguments for accepting vaccines. Again, you're not pushing them to accept the vaccine, but rather you're having them voice the arguments for accepting the vaccine. Patients tend to stop being actively engaged when conversation is pushed. So when we're able to engage and listen accurately and empathetically, our patients are more likely to fully engage in an enriching conversation. Instead of being told what to do, the patients are then an active participant in their own health and decision-making process, which is an important part of getting them to go into their own intrinsic motivation. And we have 4 strategies for motivational interviewing outlined in the acronym FORCE. The first letter is O for open-ended questions. This can help encourage a more in-depth conversation. So avoiding simple yes, no, or I don't like that kind of answers will be helpful in keeping that conversation open and allowing the conversation to go where it needs to go for that denialist style. With affirmations, what we're looking for is for the healthcare provider to help build up a patient's self-efficacy or confidence in their decision-making. So even if you can't build up efficacy in this area, vaccine acceptance, you might be able to say something along the lines of, I know you're so dedicated to making healthy choices in your life, as evidenced by, and then you can list out some of the things that you've seen them do well, engaging in a new workout regimen, cutting down on the amount that they're drinking, engaging in a healthy sleep cycle. As you're affirming them, you're winning them over to the fact that we're on the same team here, which is that we're fighting for your health. And now I can help you build up your self-efficacy, again, so you can hook into your own intrinsic motivation and confidence for making these decisions on your own. And that's what we want to communicate to our patients. With receptive listening, we're engaging deeply with the patients to ensure that they've felt heard and that they can hear themselves well. So we become this mirror for them, that what they're saying to us is bounced back to them, and they have ability to see and hear what they're saying and what they're experiencing outside of themselves. This becomes a more active listening process, both on our end and on their end, as they move to a process of decision-making. And then finally, we want to engage in summarizing. This helps to highlight the most important parts that we've taken away from this conversation, or can help call attention to something specific. Obviously, we know we've all been in conversations where things have kind of wound through a variety of topics, and you walk away and kind of wonder, wait, what did we just really discuss here? So in the process of summarizing, we're able to highlight what we want our patients to take away from the conversation. So let's move on to the enumerate style. With this style, they really struggle to understand or manipulate numbers, probabilities, or risks. A few identifying phrases to help show if an enumerate is sitting across from you would be the following. I don't care what the data say, I believe, and fill in the blank. Or I'm just afraid that I'll get this side effect, for example, GBS. It's too risky. What if this side effect happens? Or how do we really know it's safe to get the flu vaccine every year? Well, it's important to remember in these situations that temporality does not equal causality, and that correlation does not equal causality. Well, enumerates have a number of characteristics about them. They have a strong tendency to personalize. If they have heard that something has happened to someone, then they believe that it's likely to happen for them. They dramatically underestimate or overestimate the frequency of coincidences. They might believe that the plural of anecdote is data because they value anecdote or emotions over facts. And they can't understand or manipulate the concepts of probability and risk. So here are a few communication strategies that might be helpful for you as you're sitting across from someone engaging in this enumerate style. Providing mathematical information like risks and probabilities is something that likely won't help because they're not going to be processing information in that way. So try to provide non-mathematical, non-fact-based, or math-based information. So this could be analogies or stories. If you come up with a few stories for each of your kind of health topic areas or vaccines that you can pull out in conversation, this would be an excellent style to use this with. Place risks and probabilities into perspective. So my father showed the slide earlier about the different rates of things like a lightning strike or a car accident, things like that. Having risks and probabilities into perspective might be helpful for them. Explain what the disease actually does. Put it into an emotion-driven story, or possibly give a story of someone who was harmed by that disease. So perhaps you might engage outside of work with some stories online of people who weren't vaccinated and what actually happened. That is data and information that you could give to patients who are engaging in this style that might be helpful in moving them towards vaccine acceptance. This quote is from the book Self-Efficacy by Bandura, and I think that it summarizes some of what I've just talked about. That people need enough knowledge of potential dangers to warrant action, that they do not have to be scared out of their wits to act, any more than homeowners have to be terrified to purchase fire insurance for their household. And here's the important part. What people need is knowledge about how to regulate their behavior and firm belief in their personal efficacy to turn concerns into effective preventive actions. We provide them with the tools needed to exercise personal control over their health habits. And that's something that each of us can do as health professionals, that we can help build up that self-efficacy of our patients, that they can make these good decisions, they can regulate their own behavior, that they can have personal control in a healthy way over their health habits. And if we can give that to them, that is such a gift, because at some point they might move, they might not have us anymore, but their self-efficacy goes anywhere with them in any decision that they have to make. Well, what does this all mean for you? For each of us, it's important to notice how our own biases and cognitive styles play out as we meet with our patients and educate them regarding any decision, but especially within vaccine decision-making. So become a curious observer to your own life and notice what's playing out as you talk about this important topic. Communicate with your patients in a way that recognizes their preferred cognitive style. Instead of communicating out of what feels comfortable to us, we need to meet our patients where they are at and their own communication style and lens. This increases the likelihood that they will make healthy decisions about their behavior. All right, and this is just a couple articles that I've referenced throughout, as well as contact information if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's a great presentation. I'd like to kind of open the line for more questions and reactions to both your presentation and Dr. Poland's as well. Joanna, can you remind everyone how to enter the phone queue to ask their questions over the phone?
Sure. Again, to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad.
While we're waiting for some phone questions to come in, Jerry has been monitoring our chat. She also reviewed the questions that were submitted ahead of time for this presentation. Jerry, are there any questions that you wanted to bring forward?
Yeah, we do have a few questions. One of them I wanted to start with was from Kim, and she's asked, how are you talking to folks about the HPV vaccine? I know you have a slide in there, excuse me, regarding that. If you wanted to expand upon that, Dr. Poland.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I tell them that, let me start this way. I let them know that essentially every sexually active adult will become infected with HPV. Most people resolve that, and it's a moderate number who go on to develop one of about 7 different types of cancer. The other thing that it can cause is genital warts. All we can do is treat them with lasers, but we cannot cure them. So I tell them this is sexually transmitted cancer. You can't, as a parent, you can't manipulate when your child's first going to have any kind of sexual exposure. And so we recommend that they get it as early as recommended. The advantage of that now is that they only have to get 2 doses, not 3 doses. To illustrate how out of control HPV is in the U.S., the FDA has recently extended the use of the vaccine all the way to age 45. So it is a cancer-causing virus, and we can prevent it. I might add, while we're waiting for questions, is that several studies have been showing that if the doctor or nurse has a positive attitude about vaccines and recommends them strongly, even patients who are hesitant will take the vaccine at much increased percentages. So your recommendation, your attitude toward vaccines does make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Poland. We also had a number of questions related to the flu vaccine. just summarizing them, what is the best way to address patients who refuse the flu shot because they believe it will make them sick? And another kind of question that goes along with that is, why do so many nurses still refuse to get the flu vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, myself and two nurses who were prepared at the PhD level did deep interviewing studies of nurses. And I know it doesn't sound very nice to say, but it is low complexity thinking and misinformation. We have a terrible problem in the U.S. with nurses in particular, even other healthcare providers who have lower levels of education take influenza vaccine at much higher rates than nurses. I've often said that at nursing groups I've spoken to. Do you possess information that none of the scientists, none of the physicians, none of the public health officials, none of any of the other healthcare professionals don't have, and you're making a decision based on that? And what we found is that nurses are making decisions by anecdote. So they tend not to read the primary literature, so they don't know the data. And rather, what they're learning is they hear from another nurse or from a patient, well, I got the flu vaccine and X, Y, Z happened. And they take that as fact, and it becomes a fixed belief. So it's a difficult situation. In regards to how do you talk to patients about flu vaccine, I let them know the data. Okay, there's my analytics style coming out. I let them know the data if they tend toward that about what influenza can cause. I will sometimes hand them a copy of this article I wrote the day that Jack died to go home and discuss with their family. And then what I really try to do, and this has been somewhat a change in my practice, my daughter has really started to influence a whole generation of medical education to say, you have to understand your patient's style and adapt your style to them. I want the quick win, right? As a physician, I've got 20 minutes with this patient. I want them to get the vaccine before they leave my office. What I have to realize is sometimes I may have to see them 2 or 3 times and build that trust, answer those questions before they trust me enough to hear what I'm saying.
Yeah, that trust piece is huge. Joanna, did we have anyone calling over the phone with questions?
There are no questions at the moment over the phone. If you want to ask a question, ladies and gentlemen, again, that's *1 to ask a question.
Okay, we are very active in chat, so Jerry, I'll turn it back over to you for some more chat questions. But yeah, again, if you'd like to engage with us over the phone, we encourage that as well.
Sounds good, Kaylin. We actually kind of still tagging on to that flu vaccine question. We just received a question from Rachel. How do you address often patients will decline to get the flu vaccine because it only covers a few specific strands? So how do you address this and still encourage them to get the flu vaccine?
Yeah, good question. So most all of the vaccines in the U.S. now cover the 4 major strains of influenza. Variants to those strains do occur, as occurred last year, as a prime example. But even though there are strains circulating different than the ones that are in the vaccine, very often those vaccine strains offer what's called cross protection to those other viruses. So I know patients tend to have the sense of, well, I got the flu vaccine and I got the flu anyway. Well, most of the time it wasn't flu they got, but let's assume that it was. They may have developed symptoms of influenza, but because they got the vaccine, they didn't develop pneumonia, they didn't get hospitalized, and they didn't die. And those are important parameters about flu. I published an article for those of you that are interested. If you just Google my name and expert reviews of vaccines on this issue of influenza vaccine failure. It was published just a couple months ago because people have gross misperceptions about what the vaccine does or doesn't do and what what people mean when they say, even the CDC, when they say influenza vaccine failure. I hope that helps.
We had another question that was actually related to how do you recommend talking with folks who are actually educated medical scientists, look at the same data as you and I look at, but they come to different conclusions?
Yeah, that's a tough one. A technique I have often used is this. So they may be medical professionals, but they're not vaccinologists. I spend full time dealing with these data and reading and doing my own research in my own lab about this. So I'll say, what's your specialty or what area are you most expert in? And we'll go to the internet and they'll tell me something. I'll type it in and I'll find, let's say that they're a sleep specialist, just to choose an example. I'll find a site that offers misinformation about sleep disorders and how they're treated. And I'll ask them to look at them with me, and I'll say, what do you think? And they'll say, well, this isn't wrong. This doesn't fit the facts. And they'll often stop in mid-sentence. And I'll say, precisely the point. You're an expert in sleep medicine. I'm not. The person that published this blog or website isn't. And yet it's negatively influencing people's decision-making. The same thing is happening today as we're discussing the data about flu vaccines. And I'm also very transparent, as I was in the presentation today. It's not 100% effective. It's not 100% safe. But I point out nothing is, and I show them or talk to them about the data, or if they're enumerate style, I tell them in the form of a story or a parable about what these data mean. So the one, and again, a strong recommendation. The one thing I think all of us are looking for is, boy, it'd be nice to have a magic statement that we could say that would convert them like that. And unfortunately, there's just nothing like that. It's a process. I think my daughter would probably say amen to that.
We had an interesting question, Dr. Poland. They asking about what is the benefit of the vaccine denialist organizations that you had listed there?
I think for a number of them, as I mentioned, it's become a life cause. So in the 70s and 80s, there was an organization called, it was kind of cute, called Dissatisfied Parents Together, DPT. I thought that was pretty, interesting that they thought of that. And when those data became clear and they really couldn't find anybody to continue supporting their organization, I thought, well, this would go away. And to my surprise, many of these people showed up in the next anti-vaccine organization that would come around. And I began to see what others had seen, that this had nothing to do with a given vaccine. This had to do with a predisposition toward focusing their angst, their concerns about life, etc., on something, and that something is vaccines, and it becomes a fixed belief. Another way that it happens is when people misinterpret what has happened to them. So, for example, I'll give you an interesting example. A colleague of mine published an article saying, let's take an average week or month in July. Nobody's getting influenza. Nobody's getting a flu shot in July. And let's look at an average 1-week period. How many women who are in the first trimester of pregnancy will have a spontaneous abortion? How many will develop a demyelinating or autoimmune disease, etc.? And then he said, what do you think happens when the same scenario happens but during flu season? So, as you know, all pregnant women are recommended to get the flu vaccine. What do you think happens in that woman's mind if I give her a flu vaccine and a week later she has a spontaneous abortion? If she's not a very careful and thoughtful person, she's going to do what my daughter talked about and assume that temporality is causality. That is, because these two things happen close in time, they must be related, even though the data shows no difference in the rate depending on time of year or whether or not you got flu vaccine. So they come to it through a variety of sort of issues. They also leave it through a variety of issues. Very interesting to have seen the interview of this woman whose 7 children developed pertussis. She is a rabid advocate for the vaccine now, but it's an unfortunate thing. There are organizations, one that comes to mind is Families Fighting Flu. These are groups of parents that have band together because their child died as a result of a disease we can easily prevent, influenza. And they now are trying to counter this anti-vaccine misinformation because of what has happened to them.
I have a question, actually. Whoops, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to check in one more time with Joanna, see if you had any questions.
Yes, again, ladies and gentlemen, to ask a question, you can press star 1 on your telephone keypad.
Please go ahead, Jerry.
Okay. Question for Caroline. What would you recommend considering for the cognitive styles when you're talking to vaccine-resistant healthcare professionals? So kind of getting at those healthcare professionals who are refusing to get vaccinated.
Sure. Well, I think that's where we would want to engage in, the bigger story of how they've processed to get to where they are, right? I wanted to clarify that despite the fact that as healthcare professionals we are most of the time educated under an analytical style, it does not mean that all healthcare providers have an analytical style that they're using to employ their vaccine decision making. And so in some ways, it's the same conversation that you would have with a patient. Now, obviously, they're probably going to assume that they know more because of that, the training that they've gone through. I like to use in my clinical work an approach called the one down approach, where you're taking this position of a learner, and in some ways it's what we're doing with motivational interviewing. They become the expert in their own life, and we can learn a lot from people when we do that. And so when we can take that approach where we get to hear their story of decision-making process, we might be able to find some of those places where we can not only assess what their actual cognitive style is, but then to be able to maybe challenge some of that or things like that.
Kind of related question here. Do you think the mandatory mask for those who don't get, so the healthcare providers who don't get vaccinated, having them wear a mask if they don't get the flu vaccine, do you think that increases their chances of getting vaccinated, or does it just give them an option to refuse?
Yeah, I mean, this has become an important strategy. Where it's been used, it definitely increases immunization rates. And, this is where I say sometimes that, this is not science is not a democracy. When a nurse or other healthcare provider decides they want to ignore the data and refuse a vaccine and put other people at risk, vulnerable patients, then they have bridged professional ethics. And I think requiring flu vaccine or terminating them or moving them to a non-patient care or slot or requiring them to wear a mask on campus is absolutely appropriate. Not that that's a popular stance, but...
We also had a question regarding the topic of herd immunity. Can you explain, how do you explain this to resistant patients in a non-judgmental or motivational way, that the reason their child is not getting the disease reasons because others are immunized. So they haven't gotten the flu vaccine and they're not getting sick just because everybody else got immunized.
Yeah, you actually just explained it pretty well. And I tell people that the whole idea behind high rates of population coverage is that, number one, in some people, we get variable rates of effectiveness. So let's say we immunize 1,000 people, there might be one or two or a handful who won't have quite high enough of an immune response to protect them, or some children who, because of the diseases they have, cannot get the vaccine. And what we do is we're, in essence, providing a protective cocoon around them. If everybody around them is immunized, then the disease won't reach the person who's most vulnerable. And then I say, you know, while your child may not have cancer, or let's take Libby's example, or a mitochondrial disease, and therefore isn't at risk for measles and can safely get the vaccine, there may be other diseases your child is at risk for, or genetically predisposed for. And by my child getting immunized, I'm protecting your child. And, you know, you try to have that kind of thoughtful discussion, but having said that, we live in a very selfish society for the most part now. I think many commentators have noted the lack of civility in our society, and notions of fairness, justice, equity, shared responsibility seem to be waning in our culture.
You did have a question also, a couple questions actually about the new HPV guidelines, HPV vaccine guidelines for people up to the age of 45 for both men and women. They're saying, has this been published? They're not seeing the information on CDC. And what do you recommend is the best way to talk or get that information out?
I hope I was careful to say that the FDA approved it. Now what will happen is that will go to the ACIP. This is the committee that's run by CDC. I hope at their next meeting, and they will actually then formulate specific recommendations that will be then published and released. Nonetheless, the FDA has approved it, so healthcare providers can go ahead and use it. And the issue, as I mentioned, is that HPV is just frankly out of control. The rates of, I'll give you one example, there are clinics now where you have adolescent girls coming whose airways are lined with genital warts, such that every month or two they're coming in to get laser treatment. It's extremely painful. They will have to do that the rest of their life unless some new cure is discovered, because there is no cure for HPV at this time. Despite the fact that this vaccine is extremely effective in preventing these cancers and genital warts. So I try to have that conversation with them so that they understand the gravity of the decision that they're about to make. Some parents have voiced the concern that by giving their child this vaccine, that you're sort of giving them a license to be sexually promiscuous. Let me stress that these same concerns were voiced with HBV, the hepatitis B virus, and there was no evidence for that. There has been no evidence for that in the areas where it's been studied over human papillomavirus either.
Just a couple more questions here. A quick one, there was a question about how you felt about this year's flu vaccine as far as covering the different strains of flu that could be out there.
Yeah, let me just give a very quick primer on how those strains are selected. I sat on the committee for many years that selected them. So respiratory specimens are collected worldwide. Often some 2 million specimens are collected. They are cultured, the viruses that are collected sequenced, so that we get an understanding of what is currently circulating. Then we make our best guess as to, and it's that, it is our best guess as to which strains will continue to circulate. Let me stress that in the amount of time we have been on this phone call, several billion new mutant strains of influenza virus have developed. 99.9% of them don't have what we call fitness. They can't reproduce, they can't infect humans, and so they sort of die off. But the odd one now and then, and when we're talking about billions, does have fitness. So let me take as a great example the year 2000. We made the strain selections. It was based on what was circulating. The vaccine was produced by manufacturers. We're using it in October, November. It's working beautifully. Right at the beginning of November, a new mutant strain, A. Sydney, developed. And by December, all of the influenza in the U.S. was A. Sydney, which was not in the vaccine. And that's the hazard of the way current influenza vaccines are developed. That's why you hear so much about so-called universal flu vaccines, which I believe we'll probably have within the next 5 years. The idea there is that you might get 2 or 3 doses of this vaccine and you're covered for life against all strains of influenza. But we're not quite there yet.
We also had a question. Is there a big difference between the 1-dose pneumonia vaccine and the 2-dose?
Not sure what you mean by 2-dose. There is no 2-dose pneumococcal vaccine. Maybe the question's gotten a little confused. For people 65 and older, all of them should get what's called PPSV23, the polysaccharide vaccine, followed by, yes, a second dose, but of a different vaccine called PCV13, the conjugate vaccine.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification. I think we got to many of the questions in chat. Jerry, thank you so much for being our chat manager. And if there are some additional questions, we will work towards those or towards connecting those to ask them with their QIO to get some additional assistance with. I know we had a couple of questions ahead of time that were sent in regards to billing. Those people to the appropriate resources, but at this time we're going to move towards closing the call.
And let me just sort of summarize and say what we talked about today is very important, and what I enjoy about doing this is, you know, my sort of providing the medical side of it, my daughter presenting the psychosocial side of it, and it's an attempt to have you realize how important the two together are, and how important this is for individual life and health and for the public health.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Poland, Caroline Poland, for being on with us today, for taking our questions, and for these really great and engaging and well-situated presentations to help us think about this in another way. I'd like to end with just a call to action, as we do like to make these calls actionable. You can see more details on the screen. We also do ask that our participants today take a moment to complete the post-event assessment. It's going to pop up when you exit the WebEx today, and then here's also the SurveyMonkey link that will take you there as well. And like I said, there is CE evaluation information at the end of that post-assessment, as well as opportunities to give us ideas on additional topics that you'd like to see. The remaining slides that we don't have a bunch of time for is just some additional information about our next national LAN event, which is also available to a public audience, where we'll talk about patient-centered treatment options for type 2 diabetes, and that'll be in mid-February. And again, there is that opportunity for you to tell us what topics that you would like to hear most about. Thank you so much to everyone for your time today. We hope to talk with you all again in February. This time we'll go ahead and close the call.
That does conclude today's conference. Thank you for joining. You may now disconnect.